For 8 years, he flew in Air Force Two. In other words, he stood in the shadows, while his bigger-than-life president, Bill Clinton, got all the headlines and the applause. And then, after 8 years of waiting in the wings, Vice President Al Gore came away with absolutely nothing. It was just about the hottest thing on American television a decade ago, once you got past America's Got Talent or Alex Trebek's marching shirts and ties on Jeopardy. But NBC's The West Wing, set right in the White House of the United States, gave us an almost achingly perfect picture of the pain caused by human jealousy and greed. People still are fascinated watching reruns. Martin Sheen played a progressive Democrat president named Josiah Bartlet. And the interesting subplot story was about the vice president, Mr. John Hoynes, a bit role held by Tim Matheson. And it really was a bit part. NBC's official website, where it described the main players, didn't even have the vice president listed. VP? He was a nobody. So on some episodes, he didn't even appear in all the action with Josh and CJ and the others. Now, there was a man consumed with jealousy toward the president. He hated him. He loathed him. He should be the one who sat in the big desk in the Oval Office. In fact, the season opener in October back in 2000 revealed how back in the primaries it was John Hoynes who at one point led in the polls by 40 or 45 points. Now he's under Bartlet, second in command to Bartlet, attending weddings and funerals while this man he despises runs the country. I mean, you talk about stomach-twisting pain? We often complain, I've got to nurse this grudge because it's sick. And that word sick is in there for a reason, because unresolved anger and resentment actually can make you sick. An old medical journal called Holy Bible says as much. Here's the diagnosis from the book of Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 30. A heart full of peace gives life to the body, but envy and jealousy rot the bones. That's the clear word. When you and I walk around boiling with resentment or jealousy, when we harbor hatred and bitterness within our hearts, it actually affects the heart. It can make you sick. We've all felt the physical knots that can come when you allow a grudge to just sit there in your gut. Well, it's no surprise that in the fictional feuds on this NBC television program, The West Wing, find their basis in real life. Very often, vice presidents have stood on the sidelines while adoring millions cheered for their boss. Now, they've cut ribbons for the little factory openings while the main man flies to Europe and Asia aboard Air Force One. In his two-part biography entitled Robert Kennedy and His Times, Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. describes the smoldering frustrations felt by Lyndon Baines Johnson while he had to stand aside while a young billionaire from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, was sworn into power. Johnson, a huge magnetic figure in the U.S. Senate, a man used to being adored, a man used to getting his own way, well, now had to count the paper clips and sit quietly in the meetings while JFK ran this show called Camelot. Every time I came into John Kennedy's office, Johnson said later, I felt like a raven hovering over his shoulder. And he hated it. He absolutely hated it. I detested every minute of it, he confessed many years later. And minute turned out to be a predictive word because his face time alone with the president got smaller and smaller and smaller. White House Secretary Evelyn Lincoln, who kept the logs, calculated that LBJ and Kennedy had 10 hours and 19 minutes together in private conferences in the year 1961. In 63, it had shrunk to just 1 hour and 53 minutes. Not even 2 hours. Together the entire year? And of course, as historians know, after the assassination and in the ensuing 5 years before the Los Angeles tragedy of 1968, Johnson and John Kennedy's brother Bobby developed a hatred for each other that was a rabid, almost paranoid hatred. Helen Prejean describes at quite some length the walking wounded, the victims of terrible death penalty crimes, the moms and dads who lost children. So often the burdens of hatred and grudges were almost overwhelming. Except for the grace of God, some parents simply did not ever recover. I am startled to find out, this Catholic nun writes, that the divorce rate of couples who have lost a child is 70%. I find out that 4 to 7 months after the murder is critical time for survivors, because by then the shock and numbness wears off and the loss and rage set in. And then she adds, I discover new meaning for the word anniversary. These unresolved feelings of anger and bitterness were literally poisoning these people. They couldn't sleep, eat, couldn't relax, couldn't play. All they could do was plot and build up and pile on and endlessly fantasize about getting even. And as it says so simply in the Bible, after a while, the bones actually begin to rot. The book of 1 Samuel, chapter 25, tells about a crabby, resentful man named Nabal, who ironically ought to be more cheerful, considering he's rather well-to-do. But he has the habit of just snapping at everyone, like Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. He goes around singing, I hate people. And when the warrior, David, who has quietly protected Nabal's turf and his flocks and herds without payment for a long time, sends a little delegation at shearing time to ask Nabal for some victuals and a few jugs of grape juice, this sour-faced man snaps at them and tells them to buzz off. But then, remember the story? Nabal's wife, the beautiful Abigail, intervenes and sends a huge caravan of provisions and treats to David and his 600 men, preventing a bloodbath. Now here's the kicker to the story, though. Nabal, he gets drunk at a party, and when his wife later tells him what she's done, how she's undone his feud with her little backdoor gift, he actually has a conniption fit. That's right. Verse 37 says, he became like a stone, says the NIV Bible. And speaking of stones, we read that his heart fails him. He has a stroke, and 10 days later, this guy is stone cold dead. It reminds me of a quote coming from the Reader's Digest. Back in the November 1999 issue, the quotable quotes gave us this one by Jim Scancarelli. A sharp tongue sometimes cuts its own throat. Vera Sinton's book, How Can I Forgive? Contains a mountain of quiet wisdom in its 48 pages. And this observation goes directly to the point regarding the physical hurts caused by our grudges. Now I'm quoting. If the resentment is strong enough, she writes, the inner stress may take its toll on the body. Every doctor knows patients whose chronic conditions are made worse by unhealed resentment inside. So initial anger may be healthy, but long-term unhealed anger is very dangerous indeed. And again, please, It's true that an initial shock and jolt of anger might be an appropriate thing, a necessary wake-up call when something is wrong. When a selfish deed is happening or when injustice is before your eyes, the Bible tells us that that kind of anger, the first flash of it, is not a sin. But when you hold on to it, when you nurse a grudge and let it go on for 4 or 5 or 8 years while someone else runs the country while you thought it was your divine right to lead, resentment can actually become a poison, both physically and spiritually.